Dignitas have shown that they don't understand exactly the pluses and minuses of franchising, and it also has made them feel like they are kind of impervious to losing or making bad decisions. And of course, this is addressing their whole debacle of having Hooney costing 2.3 million, according to a article or report released by Jacob Wolf earlier in the year during off season. Now, the whole point of this Dignitas roster is obviously to have good, old brand coming back with the classics because they got all the classic players, right? You had Froggen, who had to be worth a pretty penny, given that, of course, Froggen can turn down a whole bunch of deals because it can't match up to the streaming revenue that he would get normally if he were to just be a streamer on Twitch, right? He's a very lucrative streamer in that sense. And he's also still quite good at the game, so he commands a very high salary. And then you have Afromu, probably still commanded somewhat of a decent salary. Of course, he was on a slump after he came off of his 100 Thieves stint, but he is still a very iconic name. And not only that, but he can kind of bargain the idea that, well, you can kind of bank on the fact that I've been in the game for multiple years, so I might just have one of the best splits in my career after that slump, right? I think you have to give a legendary player like Afremu the benefit of the doubt, right? Especially given that he is playing with a different ADC now with Johnson. So it's clear that all these three players of Huni, Froggen, Afremu command a really high salary, right? That's at least 3 million in terms of just that part of the roster itself. And then you still have to balance out the jungler and the ADC, which they get players which wouldn't command a very high salary, right? So it's very clear that Dignitas tried to go with that old school branding, but at the end of the day, people don't really put that much weight into the old school classics, right? Like, people don't care if you created, the next episode. I imagine half of the motherfuckers listening to this wouldn't even know what the fuck I'm talking about. But they would just rather hear a new hit. They want to see what you have next that is popping. They would just rather see results rather than just go for this gimmick of old school classics, right? Everybody's heard of that shit. Like, they want the new shit. And so legendary names are kind of a gamble because in one instance, if you fail, it's like a double negative, right? For your team's branding because, well, people were expecting you to succeed because you have all these legendary names, right? It comes with the expectation that you have to give results. And when you don't, like Dignitas, who didn't even make the playoffs, then it comes to bite you back in the ass. And especially after you release this player that is worth 2.3 million, over a certain amount of time span. I think it was 2 years, 3 years, something like that. And also, by the way, I don't blame Jacob Wolf for putting out that story because just holistically in the esports sense, it was very important for him to put out this story because it gave kind of a barometer to measure exactly how much these esports players are getting paid, but more specifically, how much these higher echelon, or, well, use that loosely now, but the higher echelon of players like Huni are getting paid in order to play for these League of Legends teams because of their branding and because of their skill. And so I think it was just obviously a really bad move for Dignitas because just Huni as a player, but also that it was just the double negative of both tanking your team branding and then also just gambling on these high stakes players and these legendary players, which if they do well, great, but that's to be expected. If they do bad, really bad, because that was not expected. To go back to what I was talking about earlier in the split when I made some power rankings and stuff, I actually somewhat foolishly believed in Hooney. I thought he had a fantastic summer split. I was really banking on that, and I'm like, wow, maybe this is a new Hooney. Like maybe he's a good guy after all. After he hit me so many times, maybe he's just a kind-hearted guy. No, he's a fucking scumbag. No, not to make light of abuse and shit, but it's the fact that he has kept these same tendencies of this overly aggressive player that doesn't give a shit about whatever's going on the rest of the map, what other lane states that his other laners are dealing with, and yet he's just going to play the game like it's fucking solo queue or something, and the jungler isn't going to pay attention in the top lane. So I arrogantly, or I guess ignorantly, thought that Hooney would kind of change his ways because he was playing quite more reserved in the summer split. If you remember, he was playing more back. He wasn't playing as aggressive, and he was only taking measured advantages when it was necessary or appropriate, right? And those are two different things too, because there's a necessity of it to where you might actually be doing something that is quite aggressive, but it is necessary maybe for your team to somewhat come back into the game or somewhat get an advantage. And then there's appropriate of, given all the circumstances, regardless of if there is like this losing lane on the other side, I need to play appropriate for my circumstances. And so he was doing that. He was isolating it in kind of the backwards way of what he had done currently in the spring split was, play aggressively no matter what, given my lane state and only my lane state. But no, he did that, and that's what kind of fucked everything up. But he didn't do that in the summer split. Now, another problem with Dignitas and particularly the coaching staff is, well, they started out Greg. And let's just fucking be honest, Greg is not as good as Acadian. I don't know why anyone fucking thought that Greg was better than Acadian, because he never has been. And it didn't help the team out either, because they had started Greg for the majority of the spring split, and then they try and bring in Acadian to save the fucking day for some reason. And let's also be honest that Acadian is not that good of a player in order to save the entire team. I think Acadian is a pretty good player, but he's not like this superstar jungler that can just turn around an entire season when you fucking hand him shit and you tell him it's chocolate. Like that's just, it shouldn't be expected of the guy. Because, look at the Greg versus Acadian win ratio. Greg has a 42% win rate, and Acadian has a 50%. And that's going on the back half of the split. And that's also given the fact that probably they didn't even share equal times, I'm willing to bet, in the very beginning of the split. It was probably mostly Greg playing with the team. And then about, week 4, week 5, week 6, that's when Acadian was brought in as, the second subject or the second lifeline to save the day. And like that's usually what happens a lot within a lot of other LCS teams. Now let's go to the fucking KDA of 1.9 of Greg versus 3.7 for Acadian. And now normally I don't like to harp on KDA because it's a very contextual stat, but I don't know, when you have double the fucking KDA of the other guy and you've played almost the same amount of games, I think Greg played 12, Acadian played 8, and yet he has a better win rate and a double the times KDA. So it's clear that Acadian was probably the overall better pick to begin with anyways. Now, that comes with the caveat that, yes, of course, there's different metas at different times, right? Like, Senna was very popular in the very beginning for utility ADC and shit. But, just thinking about the entire composition of Dignitas itself and the entire lineup, like, where's the other firepower? Where's the other threat without Acadian in there. You know, you have this herbivore jungler in Grig, and then you have this fucking berserk guy in the top lane that doesn't give a fuck what's going on around the map, and then you have a control style mid laner who can occasionally take over the game. I'll give Froggen that. And then you have this bot lane which is newly formed, and also a support player that is coming off of one of his worst splits in the history of his entire playing career. So it's ridiculous to think that there's going to be another threat on the entire team besides Huni himself. So although I give a lot of shit to Huni in terms of how he played, because I did think he played bad, but you have to consider that maybe he thought, you know, weirdly in the fucked up mind of like Huni Wonderland, that he had to play super aggressive because no one else was going to play aggressive. And I can kind of see that to an extent, right? I think there does need to be a wild card within the team, but there also needs to be someone else who plays aggressive too, to kind of back up that aggression and pull some aggro away from Huni himself. So then the other piece to this whole Dignitas lineup is, I think a lot of people ignore that Vulcan, you know, was the beginning piece when discussing Huni's contract and how ridiculous it is because, well, you can afford that when people buy Vulcan from you for millions of dollars, right? So in light of that, it isn't as bad as people think it is, but you still don't pay Huni that much amount of money. You know, that it's kind of like having a shit ton of money in the bank, and then yet you pay $10,000 for someone to build a PC that you could build it for $3,000. It just doesn't make any fucking sense, right? It's like, why would I pay that much money when it's clear that those parts aren't worth that much? It just doesn't make any sense. And that's what the fuck they did. They bought a pre-built computer that had fucking viruses and only had like 8 gigs of RAM and fucking Pentium 4 processor or some shit. It's like, yeah, but the video card's dope. Like, yeah, the video card's dope. Like, come on, dude. Anyways, so I feel like franchising has put these owners and these GMs in a place feeling like they're invincible, right? Like after they leave the contract negotiation table, they're just like, oh yeah, sure, we paid this much, but remember back in the day where paying this much would essentially be suicide, because if you didn't get up into, you know, the away from relegation, then you would be fucked, and you would have massive debt and all this other shit. Like, so I feel like owners and GMs have this idea that just because they tank a split, and granted, of course, Dignitas came in 7th, so they wouldn't have even been in relegations anyways. But it's the idea that money just doesn't fucking matter in the short interim, right? It's about building this entire fanfare or this entire base, and then from there you can mold into something and you can take time. But that doesn't mean that you should be so reckless with your budget or your revenue, because now we probably know that Dignitas next year is going to be this shit fucking budget roster, and it's going to be pretty fucking awful, right? And also on top of that, reviving a brand is very, very, very hard, right? Like you look at Golden Guardians, while yes, they have done better this year, they still have that shadow of being last place previous years, right? So it still hangs over Golden Guardians' heads, and that's going to take a while to dig out that ditch, because the negativity is actually more impactful than the positivity of being in 4th or 3rd place or whatever. No one remembers 3rd or 4th place or 5th place. Everyone remembers 10th place or 9th place, right? So reviving a brand is very hard. And when you have something like a $2.3 million contract in which you release in the middle of an entire year, right? You didn't even finish out the year. You just did it in between splits. That is something that weighs heavily on your entire team and your entire brand. So I just think Dignitas just fucked up their entire year. I don't expect them to do anything within the summer split. And I think they came into the franchising era a little bit arrogant, with these pompous ideas to revive their brand, maybe with older legacy players, and it didn't pan out. It double backfired against them, and I just don't think they have intelligent people when it comes to the actual business of franchising, and especially within this new era of League of Legends esports.